The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Cami McElhenney, and I am NACOLE's Director of Training and Education. I'd like to start today's session by thanking each of you for joining us today for the first official event in NACOLE's 2020 webinar series, where today we will be discussing the mediator's perspective of officer-civilian mediations. As many of you might know, NACOLE has offered several webinars in the past few weeks specific to how COVID-19 has impacted civilian oversight of law enforcement. We'll be offering additional webinars like those in the coming weeks, along with those webinars we already had planned for the 2020 webinar series. We also will be presenting the 2020 annual conference virtually this year. Plans are already underway, and we'll be sending out registration information and session details shortly. Before I turn things over today, I would like to go over a few things regarding today's program. First of all of you have entered today's webinar in listen-only mode. As soon as we begin, however, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have for our speakers. During the webinar, you may also send any questions you might have for me as the webinar administrator in the same manner, and I will work to answer your questions as quickly as possible. With our housekeeping duties out of the way, I would like to introduce you to today's moderator, Rochelle Howard. Rochelle serves as the Deputy Director of the Office of Police Complaints for the District of Columbia. Rochelle?
Hi, Cami. Thank you so much. What a pleasure to have this opportunity to hold this webinar for our NACOLE community. And with that, I'll introduce and talk about the program, and we'll introduce the mediators that we have available for everybody today. Over the last 4 years that I've been working with the Office of Police Complaints in Washington, D.C., I always get asked about mediation. I always get asked what happens in the room during the mediations, how we manage the program, how we transform the program. People always want to know what it's like to be in a mediation. So grateful that we're able to give this webinar to people and bring two of our wonderful mediators to the platform so that they can tell you themselves about what happens in mediations at the Office of Police Complaints in Washington, D.C. Of course, we will adhere to confidentiality, but with our esteemed mediators, I know that they hold that within their own rights and their own ethics, and so I have no concern about that with the information that they're putting forth. I have, like as I mentioned, we have been managing the Washington, D.C. Office of Police Complaints mediation program since 2016, and it's transformed a bit since over the last 4 years. When I first came to the Office of Police Complaints, the mediation program was kind of managed by a program analyst, which it is still today. Chris Weber is our program analyst at Office of Police Complaints that runs the day-to-day in and outs of the mediation program. He manages the referrals, he selects the mediators and which referrals go to them, and he also kind of guides the mediator, complainants, and officers through the process as the daily needs come about. When I first came to the program, we only had one mediation vendor. And that vendor had been the first and only vendor that handled mediations and provided us with mediators since 2001 when the office began. What we found is that the diversity in the mediations could have used some more interest. And so we did market research. We went out into the mediation industry in Washington, D.C. to see what other mediation samples, templates, what other types of mediators we could get. And so that's what led to the diversification in the mediators that we have now. And we have Catherine Morris. She is the senior mediator at an organization called Consensus Building Institute. I'll explain a little bit about Catherine and her work at Consensus Building Institute. We also have Waleed Abdul Jawad. He's the founder at Ether Mediation, and he'll explain a little bit more about his work, and I'll give you some of his background. Through the diversification market research that we did, we've been able to find a varied type of mediators from different levels of expertise, different levels of styles in mediation. And I've talked to several people across NACOLE over the years about how we choose the mediators and how we manage the program. And one of the things that I tell everyone is that diversification in the types of mediation styles that we bring to the program most importantly allows our office to have the feedback that we need to continue growing the program. Of course, police community mediations is very unique. It's not normal. It's not unique to us because we're in the civilian oversight industry, but it is unique to mediators, and there's not really a comparable model of mediation as we do it at the Office of Police Complaints. I call it transformative facilitation, where we expect the mediators to help the community member and the police officer come to kind of a platform where they hear each other and that they understand each other. We usually find that when we refer a case to mediation that there's a misunderstanding. The officer didn't have a piece of information, or the community member didn't have a piece of information, or they had assumptions that led to their behavior in the interaction. And so we ask the mediators to take that crux, get to the point, and help each person be heard. And as many of you know, when I talk about a mediation program, the best that we can ask our members, our participants in the mediation, is to allow the other person to be heard, and the best expectation they can have is for themselves to be heard. So as I said, it's very, very unique, but all of the mediators that are with us now in the program have conquered that uniqueness in their own right and with their own mediation style, and that's why it's a pleasure to have you hear from them. So without further ado, I'll introduce both of our mediators to you. We have Catherine Morris. As I said, she's a senior mediator at the Consensus Building Institute with more than 20 years of experience as a mediator and as a consensus builder. She works with diverse and often opposing parties to reach a better understanding of the problem and the intersection of parties' interests to facilitate an agreement. Since September 2017, Catherine has been an independent mediator in our office and has had some wins and losses to learn from, and she'll explain some of those today. Catherine has provided not only transformative mediations helping the community, but tremendous insight for the agency's mediation program growth. Catherine received her mediation training from the Virginia Mediation Service Center, and uses those skills to facilitate multi-party negotiations and collaborative problem solving from the local to international level. And then we have Waleed Abdul-Jawad, a mediator certified by the Virginia Supreme Court and the General District Court and Juvenile and Domestic Relations. He mediates cases throughout Virginia's courts, Arlington County government, and the District of Columbia. Waleed has been an independent mediator for the Office of Police Complaints since September 2019, and as the founder of Ether Mediation, LLC, he provides mediations for private party disputes in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Building on his graduate degree in conflict resolution, Waleed teaches mediation and conducts workshops on conflict resolution in Northern Virginia and the District of Columbia. His past experience in facilitation includes negotiations with foreign interlocutors as a team lead for the U.S. Department of State. So Waleed, Catherine, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So hopefully I didn't miss anything in your introductions. Feel free to add what you feel, because you both are great within your right as mediators, and we're so glad to have you. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we get a lot of questions from the entire community that we deal with about what happens in the mediations. So let's start off with this. Can each one of you tell me one thing that you're most impressed with by the mediation program or the mediations that you've done in your time with the Office of Police Complaints?
Most impressed with? That's, I think, I would just have to say that it's one of the things that I find impressive is the number of successes that you have over the arc of a year, and the range of both the types of complaints that we're dealing with, as well as and the magnitude of severity of those complaints, as well as just the diversity of DC population in general and officers population.
Waleed?
I'm really impressed by the process that you run the mediation through, from getting the complaint, processing it, and the orientation part of it, which I think is critical. It sets expectation, it defines the outcome, and then you hand it over to us, or at least to me, and I feel like I can actually just focus on the issue at hand and move the process forward.
So I'll give a little context to what Waleed is talking about. As I mentioned before, we have a program analyst, Chris Weber. Chris, if you're watching, hi. Chris really, every time we do an orientation for new mediators, he really goes through that training program and updates it. As I said, we always learn from the feedback we get. We always learn from the interactions with the mediators when we explain the mediation program because it is unique and it is different from everyone's experiences. And then we add in new examples, new templates, things like that, so that the mediators that come after you will have that feedback as well. A little bit more context, we have an orientation that we ask all mediators to come through. We say it's about 2 hours. It usually lasts more depending on the questions and the conversation that we have. But it literally goes through the history of the office, the history of the mediation program, and then it talks about how our mediations are run step by step. It's very, very detailed, giving each mediator as they come on board with us the kind of overview of what to expect. In our office, we don't have mediators at the Office of Police Complaints on staff. We hire them as independent contractors. And we do that for a reason. And the reason is because we don't want to be in those mediations. I've never been involved in a mediation. I've never seen one. I've never sat in one in the years I worked in the program. And we deliberately do that so that it doesn't feel like our office or that the government is overseeing the mediation. We really give the freedom to the mediators and the participants to have a neutral, non-governmental process with the expertise of the mediators. And so that brings up another note. We don't hire government mediators. We only hire mediators from the private sector for that reason, so that the participants have a very neutral, non-governmental affiliated mediator, leader, facilitator in that mediation to guide them through. And so when we bring them on board, the mediators are from the private sector. And so we have very detailed information, samples, templates, we kind of go through the process. And so Catherine and Waleed both were talking about the referrals. And the investigation division decides that a case should go to mediation, they send it to Chris, the program analyst, and he kind of looks at the fact pattern and decides which mediator it should go to, and he'll facilitate that connection. But then the mediators schedule the mediations themselves based on their schedule, and they send the documentation to the Metropolitan Police Department to be able to procure the officer's presence. And so that orientation, along with the philosophies, the history, and the goals of the program is what we share in that orientation. Okay, so
just to explain a little bit more, this from the mediation theoretical point of view is that satisfaction triangle. So you have the process, you have the emotion, and you have the results. And you're taking care of quite a bit by providing the process, setting the expectation, which speaks to the emotional side. So the mediator becomes, complete that triangle with the results. Good.
Well, thank you. We'll keep that in mind. So let's go to the first question I would like to pose to each of you, if that's all right. The question is, how have you adapted your individual mediation style to civilian officer mediations? And what was the biggest adjustment you had to make to do that? Catherine, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, you did mention that I work for a nonprofit organization that does consensus building by virtue of our name. And so most of my experience coming into this was with large groups. Well, large being anywhere from 6 to, 45. I'd say that's where we have the opportunities to really help groups come together. They're usually very diverse set of stakeholders that are being impacted by or will be impacted by a decision that's being made by the public sector or some other entity. But our work is usually to try to get them to talk to each other and to talk to whoever is the convener in a problem-solving format. So most of my mediation experience up until the police mediations have been probably more behind the scenes with individuals that are participants in these larger negotiations, and sort of helping them figure out best ways forward for dealing with potential conflicts with other individuals or other stakeholders in the group. That said, I think there is a lot of carryover of that sort of joint problem-solving approach that we use at the Consensus Building Institute to these mediations. And one of the key elements of the joint problem-solving forum would be, one of the key ingredients, I'd say, is just so that bringing people together and starting with an understanding, creating that understanding of each other's perspective, which is giving them the chance to hear from each other the experience that they bring to the room about an issue, how they may perceive the facts differently or interpret the facts differently based on that experience. And that leads them often to see different kinds of solutions. So we're trying to draw out those types of basic listening skills with each other that we also need to use in these mediations. So I'd say that's been a nice transferable skill, even though it's a very different kind of forum. And I think that you know, that's the first place that we begin on these mediations, is just getting people to listen to each other and understand that their truth may not be the only truth.
Exactly. Catherine, do you want to talk a little bit more about the types of, I guess, sectors of the international world that you work with? Because I know your background was a little different from what we normally work for.
Most of my work is actually domestic. I have been doing some work with the World Bank over the last 5 years, and on the international front, but most of my work has been on domestic energy policy questions. So, for instance, I've led negotiations between commercial and recreational fishermen, and offshore wind developers, because clearly there's a lot of intersection in their the interest of the fishermen in where the particular turbines might be sited in the ocean, and how that might interfere with their quality of life and their need to get their revenue. So that's an example. I've also done everything at the other end of the spectrum, dealing with the question of what's the role of nuclear energy in U.S. facing climate change, and that has involved the nuclear industry and organizations like the Union of Concerned Scientists, who have been traditionally opposed to nuclear energy. So trying to get them to come together and talk about those intersections and their joint interests.
And the reason why I wanted you to bring that up is because I hear a lot when I get questions about how we run our mediation program, about what types of mediators. And I think it's a myth that you don't have to hire community mediators in the natural sense of the word. I hire private sector mediators, or I have hired private sector mediators, where I can see in the different types of work, like your work, Catherine, that you do, and that skill that's needed to facilitate those very diverse stakeholders. That's a very difficult measure to close. But the skill that's needed to close that is something that I think would help our program, and it's worked out in the last several years. So I did want to put that out there. You're one of the mediators that had a very different subject matter in your mediations from most that we see. And so that's an example of how I look at resumes and talk to the mediators before we bring them on board, to look at the different skills that each mediator has. And when you've been doing it for 20 years, that skill has been crafted. And if you can do it in the energy field with fishermen and wind turbines, then you can do it with police officers and community members in Washington, D.C. So I did want to highlight that. But thank you for coming on board, and thank you for explaining that. Waleed, how have you adapted your individual mediation style to civilian officer mediations, and what has been the biggest adjustment you have had to make?
So I practiced in two different styles of mediation. One is the facilitative style, which is you empower the parties, and you just kind of step back and just help make sure that they stick to the ground rules, and helped peel the layers from the position to the interest, and try to do the brainstorming and get them to an agreement. And I've done the evaluative one, which is more what I've used when I was working for the State Department, and trying to get people to think through things and help them to get to a logical conclusion, and reality check throughout that process. Here, the process is a little bit different, and that's clear division lines between the two, but I would say it's more evaluative because the goal is not to get to a written agreement and not start from a position and peel the layers and try to find the interest, and then try to figure out how to brainstorm to come to a satisfying conclusion for both sides that are fair and empowered. So here the process is different because the source of the conflict is different. So here, as you have said in the intro, the data, the information becomes the source of the issue. At least that's one of the layers. So there is a miscommunication, misunderstanding, assumptions, and expectations. And by bridging that and just revealing those and allowing both sides to explain their position, how they see things, that can be very helpful and can bridge that gap. But then there's another layer, and that is the value layer. And the value layer has a different aspect. And although the mediation does not try to solve it specifically, it does touch on it. And that is speaks to historical trauma and the perception of what police work is, and how that my role as a complainant or as a community member in this process, and how that kind of misses the mark, in my opinion. So those are some of the things that come into play, the information and the value system by which the criteria of evaluation is a little bit different. And by going through the process of mediation, you kind of reveal those things and help both sides see the other person as a human being and somebody who has a role to play. And of course, at the end, it's the acknowledgement of hurt, or to actually listen, to feel that the other person heard you. And that is where the mediation kind of shines and brings people together.
So thank you, Walid. I'll ask you too to talk a little bit more about your background. You call our work evaluative facilitation, which I fully accept, and I'll work that into some of our future interactions with new mediators. I call it, of course, transformative facilitation. But I think the goal of both of those terms is for the participants to understand where the other person's coming from, and the hopes, even if the mediation isn't what we call resolved, that conversation of, that they had, the very valuable conversation that they have, will resonate with them in some way. And so for the community members, when they go back to the community, they can tell others about how hopefully they had a good experience in the mediation. And then it may transform future interactions with police officers, and vice versa for the police officers. Hopefully they had a very good experience in the mediation, a conversation that they could take something away from, and then hopefully in the future, when they're interacting with similar community members, they remember that conversation and the understanding that they learned. I will put a plug in here. We do surveys in our mediations before and after, and one of the things we ask both participants is how satisfied they were with the mediator, how satisfied they were with the mediation process, and then we ask the officers if they thought mediation was a fair forum for the complaint that was brought to them. And we just did the numbers for the first and second quarter, and it's still above 90% for all of those questions on all participants. Mostly officers find that the mediator was helpful at 100%, that the mediation process was a fair forum for the complaint, which is very interesting because another part of our program is that the program isn't, the officers have to comply. They don't get a say whether or not they participate in the mediation. If we send an appearance request, they have to appear, and if they don't, we can send a memorandum to the chief of police and say that they failed to appear and or did not participate in good faith, and they can be disciplined for that. So very interesting survey results when one party doesn't have a say. The community members, we work through their preferences in the mediation to make sure they're comfortable with the mediation. We never would want a community member who felt like they've been hurt by a police officer to be forced to go through a mediation. So we work through that with them. One other thing, though, I did want to follow up in, Walid, can you tell us more about your background so everyone can see what your diversification is as well?
Throughout my work as a facilitator, I did facilitate negotiations with international actors or interlocutors between the U.S. Department of State, and these communities. It was a new project that was started in 2006, whereby the State Department realized that there is a conversation going on that is beyond the traditional mediums of mass media and reporters, and that there was an opportunity to speak directly to people. And when that office was being put together, they were generous enough to allow for best practices as a facilitator or conflict resolver to be put in place as a pilot program. And at that point, I was given a lot of latitude to kind of distance myself from the guidance and the language that was used in press releases and what have you, and have a candid discussion with people overseas. And mostly most of the people that we're focused on are opinion leaders, so that we can actually get them to understand where we stand and how does it work. And part of it was the data information aspect of conflict sources, because there was a gap in linguistic and cultural, and those were the two major hurdles. And my focus was Middle East, and at that time, 2006, things were happening, were focused on the Middle East. So it was a very interesting and very revealing time, where facilitation did help a lot by bringing bigger echo and bigger communities on board with understanding, not agreeing with the US, but understanding where we're coming from.
So another example of how diversified experience is added to our mediation program, just like Catherine's experience. If I just looked at the resume and said, oh, he hasn't worked with local government, he hasn't worked in the community before, the domestic community before, then we wouldn't have hired him. But I realized, at least I believed I realized looking at your resume until I met you, that type of experience was very sophisticated, and you've had to have had some kind of great background in facilitation mediation to be able to effectuate US, Middle Eastern cultures and the participants in those cultures and have those conversations. And those are the type of skills that we want in our mediation program. So again, I get a lot of questions about how do you hire mediators? Do you hire community mediators? It's not that we don't hire community mediators. I look for specific skills. And both of you have had very sophisticated participants in your previous background of mediation facilitation, and those skills obviously would work and do work really, really well for our program as well. So another example of how we go through that process. Before we move on to our next question that we talked about, I want to throw a question out to each of you, because I know it always comes up as well. Another unique metric in our process is that we don't do mediation agreements. We don't have the community member or the officer come to an agreement. And honestly, for practical purposes, we used to in the previous model of mediation. But the problem is we have no control over the community members. And so if a community member doesn't uphold their part of an agreement with an officer, there's no way for the Office of Police Complaints to effectuate that. And vice versa for the officer. We have no control over the Federal Fraternal Order of Police or the Metropolitan Police Department for us to work with them, and then it would be another protocol, another process for us to work with them to ask them to comply with their agreement. So it really would be a voluntary agreement. But even more importantly, I don't want the agreement to be the focus of the mediation. And so we don't even allow mediation agreements in our mediations now, because we want the focus of the mediations to be on the communication, the understanding, and future relationships and future interactions. So I'm going to ask you both. I'm going to start with you again, Catherine. How has that affected mediations, and what effect do you think it has in the mediations?
Well, I would just clarify that there is an agreement of sorts, and I think that agreement is that the complainant and the officer have to sign a piece of paper at the end of the mediation that says that they feel it has been resolved or not, that they feel it has been resolved, and that as a result of that resolution, that the complainant will not press forward with an investigation of the officer. I think the key element there is the definition of resolved. So I talk at the very beginning of every mediation about what that means. And that is, and explain that that is one outcome of every mediation. And there are other outcomes, and, you know, obviously the other outcome is that it does not get resolved and it could be pushed forward back to the investigator. But they also have to understand that the investigator could decide not to move forward with a full investigation on the basis of whatever facts they see on paper. So we explain those three outcomes at the very beginning. And that really sets the tone. They have to, I think it sets the tone for the officer, because for him or her, it may, you know, the best outcome would be that the investigation gets dropped, right? So they have some incentive to resolve it. For the complainant, there is some, you know, they take a risk that if it moves back to investigation, that it still may not move forward. And, you know, how are they going to feel about that? So there's a risk there for them as well. So yes, there isn't a formal agreement that each of the individuals will do anything in particular in changing their behavior or compensating the other party, as you might find in some traditional mediations. And that did take it, I think, during our training, and you said this, I wasn't the only one that does this. I kind of go, well, what's the incentive then if they're not going to agree to anything? You know, I don't get it. And it took it really just took going through the process a couple of times to understand that transformational piece that you keep talking about, to understand that there really is an inflection point in the middle of many of these mediations where you see a shift that may or may not lead to permanent changes in behavior, but you hope at least results in some piece of some recollection of this conversation in the future if they were to encounter a similar situation, right, on both sides. So I think that's the, you know, when they walk out of the room, they may shake hands, they may not. You know, even if they resolve it, you can't always be completely clear in an hour and a half or 2 hours that both individuals have completely resolved it in their own mind, you know, but you hope that given time and the opportunity to process the conversation, that it will make a difference.
Of course, thank you. And Waleed, what's your impressions of that?
Well, this is when I started, I commended you for having a process that actually is very clear and effective. And part of it is Chris and the great work that he's doing.
Exactly.
Part of it, part of what he does, as I can tell from this side, is he will go through a protocol process where figure out if it's appropriate for mediation. And to me, that sounds like if it's appropriate to be dealt with as a data conflict, as an information conflict. So it is a very specific kind of conflict where the source is the information gap. And that's where it comes to mediation. And that to me makes sense, because there are some other options that your office can choose from, and that is to continue investigation and to make some other recommendations. So, but there is a trust in the process that once it gets to the point that it is determined that it is an information conflict appropriate for that specific kind of coming together over information, which includes other things, as I said in the beginning, you know, it's layered. There is a value system, there is an emotion, there is an acknowledgement, and all of that stuff that has to come with it to reach that resolution at the end. But the resolution, when you come to information, is not to agree with that information as much as accept that that information is valid.
Very good. Thank you for that impression and that interpretation of how the fact that we don't have mediation agreements, I guess, applies to you and how you decided to do your mediations within our program. So let's move on to our next question. And I want to make sure we get to this question. As you can see, these conversations the time flies and we can talk about this for forever. So I have another very important question I would like each of you to comment on, because this is the one that everyone wants to hear. How have you effectuated transformative mediations in the civilian officer context? And can you share some examples? Like, these are the secrets, right? Catherine, again, we'll start with you. I know you're good at providing examples, so tell us some secrets. Just kidding, within confidentiality.
If I've developed any secrets, it's been in part trial and error. It's been a learning journey, because I've found that in many cases, the two parties themselves, the officer and the community member, may reach that tipping point in the conversation by themselves, by finding, as I think Waleed mentioned, by finding that humanity in each other. And sometimes that's a shared interest, a very, really, I felt moving moment in one mediation was when a woman was in a very tense conversation with an officer about how she felt his behavior and words were very dismissive of her concerns and her daughter's concerns in an incident where he was both present and also dealt with it at the station in a follow-up investigation. And it was over an incident where there had been some fighting between some teenagers, and some words were said that certainly, I can understand how the woman felt that she was being dismissed, or like, just because she didn't win, you can't complain, sort of remark. And over the course of sort of that peaking as the height of the tension, they came to a realization that they were both doing volunteer work to stop teenage fighting in DC in very different venues. One is a social worker, and the officer was working in a community-based program where he was trying to make a difference as well. And I think that when they reached that realization that they both thought it was a problem, and they were both trying to deal with it in their own ways, and both had experienced it personally, it was just a moment where, they started talking as if they were good friends all of a sudden, and that they were, they're both, going to fix this problem, and they were both really committed to it and passionate about it. Sometimes it does take a little prodding. It does take the mediator to reframe, and I use that term to say that when somebody says something that's very emotionally packed or has some very aggressive words in it, that you try to reframe it in a more neutral way so that it can be heard. And it takes that reframing to get the message across to the other person, that the intent is not always, that the intent isn't always or the emotion, I guess, that comes out in these conversations is sometimes camouflages what good intent is there, or what motivation might be behind somebody's behavior. So reframing, I think, is a really important tool, and sometimes I become much more directive in mediations where I feel like we're kind of going round and round in circles in the conversation, just repeating the same positions on both sides and not really making any progress. And I think that's when you sort of have to make some interpretations and clarify what's going on, and actually translate some of what's not being said for the other person, so that it can be heard, and it might get them across the threshold that they're stuck on.
So Catherine, what are some of those reframing statements or comments that you'll make to kind of push the conversation more to learning or hearing or being understood?
Well, I can remember saying in some situations where after somebody has, shown a huge amount of frustration or anger, to say something to the effect of, well, putting yourself in their position, can you now understand how they might have misinterpreted or interpreted this in such and such a way? Or to the complainant, now that you understand the procedures that the officer was following, and why he, you know, some of the experience he's had in the past that led him to follow these procedures quite closely. Do you now understand that, you know, it wasn't anything personal? It was much more an issue of him, you know, making sure that he was safe as well. So, you know, just simply, as I said, being a little bit more directive and saying, do you get it now? You see this, you see it from this perspective now, so that they are sort of put in a position where they have to say yes or no, right? They have to, they kind of have to either acknowledge it, and that acknowledgement is that tipping point, or they have to dismiss it, and then we're back where we started.
Very good points. Thank you. Waleed, how have you effectuated transformative mediations in the civilian officer context, and what secrets do you have for us?
I go back to the evaluative model, which, you know,
True.
it
Yes.
kind of goes, ultimately it would be transformative, right? But just because of the time and the margins that we're working with, and it makes it a little bit hard to have that as a goal from the outset. So the evaluative model helps with the reality check aspect of moving the discussions forward. So let's say one of the cases, I'm kind of expanded a little bit. It's not specifically that case, but I'll share the following. There was a complainant that thought that race was an issue, and it was very interesting. And the questions were that after we went through what Catherine was saying, all the questions and getting the procedure and getting them to yes and no, and then I got to I don't know, and that's where I go, okay. So if you were another race, how would the event would unfold? And the answer was, we really don't know. How about if the officer was a different race? How about if you switched races with the officer? And it started coming. It's like, maybe it's my age, and this was an older complainant. And it's like, okay, how would it look that way? And while we're going through these questions, like, you know, my friend told me as I was coming here that maybe it is my lens of looking at other people that was the problem. And I thought that was just revealing, and I didn't expect to get somewhere with that line of questioning, to the point of sharing something so, you know, it's what she was critical of her own self, or sharing that weakness or fault in her perception. So I thought that was very interesting. It's just the reality check and getting to maybe what Catherine uses as a yes or no, so that it's a point of inflection, and maybe it's an epiphany that would help people move beyond and see the humanity in each other.
Very good. So Waleed mentioned something about the time frame, the short time frame that we have in mediations. One of the things I always talk about, and I know different offices across the civilian oversight industry handle this within our country, we limit our mediations to 2 hours. And everyone, you probably all just gasped. We limit them to 2 hours, one session, and I always get reactions to that. But once you come into our model, and once you work within the program, and Waleed and Catherine, I'll let each of you talk about that first impression and how it's transformed recently, very, very briefly. Once you work within our model, because it's based on that very one point of understanding, or whatever that one difference is, once you get there, and hopefully the mediators get the participants there fast, I promise you the mediations, we've had some of our best mediations where they're leaving hugging, leaving shaking hands, happen within 20, 30 minutes. Most of our mediations with the mediators that we have now, and they've all been on board with us for a while, actually are always under an hour, 45 minutes. If it starts to go over an hour, mostly when we talk to the mediators, it's because they let a certain participant repeat themselves several times, which is what both of you talked about. Just briefly, Catherine first, and then Waleed, can you talk about what your first reaction to that was and how you're handling our time frame now?
Yeah. Well, some of my multi-party negotiations go on not for just hours or days, but sometimes months, because we spread it out. You know, we have it, and a lot of that is trust building and getting to know each other. And yes, of course, you've got more stakeholders at play, but I was incredibly skeptical and worried going in, like, how am I going to close this out in that time frame? I think, Waleed, you said, how do we know when it's done? I mean, one of the things that I've learned, and this really sort of plays off something that you said to me very early on, Rochelle, which is, you know, remember that you're dealing with perhaps 10 minutes, the worst 10 minutes of these individuals' day, that you're going to have to take them back through. And the truth is, it really is, a lot of these interactions are quite short, but that doesn't mean that the emotions or that the impact isn't strongly felt. And so part of it is making sure that you've set clear expectations. And I really wanted to talk a little bit more about just the structure you have created that I think makes this work. The ground rules, the expectations of the outcomes, who ultimately gets to make the decision, which would be the investigator if it goes back. So, you know, setting that context and learning how to prepare them. You encouraged me to do more sort of individual caucusing at the beginning, or individual caucusing in the midst of it if I need to sort of break patterns. I found that to be tremendously effective. Partially because you get them, they're allowed to come in and speak with you one-on-one at the very beginning to understand what the process is, to ask you questions without, you know, already feeling like they're in the midst of it. And you can let them vent some of that emotion on you before they go in to talk to each other. So I found that to be very helpful and can really jumpstart an effective, constructive conversation.
So if I could just jump in and explain that, Chris and I both make ourselves available at the beginning of the mediations to answer any process questions that Chris, in talking to the complainants or officers prior to the mediation, that they still have. Chris and I both will go in, mostly Chris really, will go in and talk to them and explain any questions they have, any procedural questions they have, any worries they have about how all this will play. Some common questions from the officer is the confidentiality of it, which is a very real concern. And so we can explain how the office, not just the mediator, will keep that confidentiality under the law of the District of Columbia. But then a common question for the mediator is, well, how do I know that this is going to be better for me? You know, I put myself through this experience, and how do I know that this officer is not going to do this again? And I can explain to them the kind of rules behind mediation. We don't allow officers to go through mediation over and over and over again. They can only go through mediation once a year for each different type of allegation. So, for example, if the officer had a harassment complaint against him in the previous year, within the previous 12 months, we don't allow that same officer to come back and mediate with another complainant who had filed a harassment complaint against them. So some of those procedural questions, and then venting through that frustration or those confusions, allows Chris and I to kind of, as Catherine said, tamper some of the anxiety that the participants may have previous to going in and focusing on the incident. Waleed?
I thought it was impossible. I was going to try. I was like, okay, if you're willing to take a chance on me, I'm willing to give it a try. My previous experiences, yes, international, over months, many months, and court referred mediation. Peeling the layers, going from position to interest, and then trying to brainstorm and figure out and coming to a point where both sides feel like it's a fair outcome, that takes quite a bit of time. And if it's on the family side, then it takes longer even than the general district small claims. So coming to this model, not knowing all that I now know, made me think that I'm going to fail from the, it might take a few tries to maybe try to understand or have the insights to guide the process to successful conclusion. But the way that I rely on it is I care about the venting quite a bit, and I want to make sure that both sides are heard, and I want to peel, the emotion from the hurt on the complainant and the uniform on the officer to just see the humanity in each other. And that is where I kind of invest most of the time, and I allow people to spend enough time for the other person to understand. And I do, of course, the reframing and trying to repeat and being engaged and making sure that they are heard by me as a mediator who is a guardian of the process, to help the other side see the person for what they are, as a human being, as a fallible, have hurt, and at the end acknowledge them, acknowledge that humanity. To do it in the time frame that you suggested, I thought it was going to be impossible, but maybe I'll add a career of psychology to it, but learn a little bit more, and because I am impressed by being able to get there. But then again, it is the process that you put in place, and that process needs to be acknowledged. Only the ones that are appropriate for this type of mediation, at least get the ones that I've seen, get to me. So I am set up for success when it comes to the mediation.
I would just add, when you read the complaint on paper, which is the only thing that we get in advance, we get in advance a description of who the two individuals are, and then we get a description of, written by the complainant or the investigator, of the incident and the charges of the mediation. And I swear, every single one I've ever read, I'm going, this is never gonna settle. This is never gonna be resolved, because you just hear the emotion and the anger on the paper, and you think, oh, this is just not, we're not gonna do it. And so I've gotten to trust the fact that no matter how conflictual it sounds like on paper, it's, when you get two people in the room, there is a moderation of some of that.
Well, not to tout anyone, Catherine, but I think you only had one unresolved case last year. We keep all the metrics. We don't manage the program by resolution rate, because there's no way to control that. If a participant decides that they will not agree that it's resolved, we can't make them. But we do keep track of the numbers so that we have the metrics. So we'll lead a big feat to follow. So there's your challenge for your first full year with us. We have about 7 minutes left. I want to pose it out to questions. I know Cami mentioned in the beginning about the chat room. So if anyone, Cami, if I'm right, has any questions, you'll field those and we'll keep the discussion going. So please feel free to take up the next 7 minutes with any questions you have. These are some of our best mediators in the program, and they have very valid opinions of the work that we do and the work that they do for us. So feel free to tap into that knowledge.
We do have some questions.
Okay.
The first one is for Catherine or Waleed. Do you have a standard rules of engagement at the beginning of each mediation in order to help set the tone of a respectful and cordial conversation or interaction? If so, have you ever found the need to adjourn the mediation and have a caucus session with each party to determine a vexed issue? How challenging has that been?
Catherine, will you answer that one?
Sure. So we do have specific rules that are required. One is confidentiality, and they sign an agreement. The other one is participating in good faith, and that is something I think the investigator goes through with them, but I repeat, participating in good faith means you haven't already decided what the outcome of this before listening to each other. And if somebody, and I have had individuals say, oh no, there's no way I'm going to resolve this. That's a pretty big red flag right there, that this is not, in good faith. And we can dismiss it out right up front. The other key one is that I let the complainant go first in every situation. I think that helps balance some of the power dynamics when you have a police officer and a community member in the same room. So I let the individual who has filed the complaint go first. And I tell both of them, the other key thing is that we are not here to agree about exactly what happened. We're here to listen to how what happened impacted you. So, you know, there's absolutely no chance we're going to agree on the facts about who said what. So that we try to keep them away from that he said, she said, you know, and arguing over, you know, and I have to say, one of my very first mediations, I lost because that's where they spent all their time, is arguing whether or not the officer said such and such when he approached her in the car, and I couldn't get them off of that. So those are the main ground rules that some of which are required and some of which we can sort of amplify. The other thing that I have never done a caucus in the middle. No, well, that might not be true. I pulled Rochelle in, or Chris in, to help me in the middle, because I've been, I feel like I've gotten, and I think one of these cases was where I didn't think it was good faith, but I didn't know how exactly to interpret that. I have not pulled the individual parties away from the table in the middle. I do most of that at the beginning, but I've never found that any of them go beyond an hour.
So a few clarifications on what Catherine said. There are no win and losses. There's resolved and no win or losses.
Right.
There's resolved and unresolved. But the director of Office of Police Complaints, Mr. Tobin, says this too, especially when he testifies to the council. Even if a mediation doesn't come to a resolution where they sign the agreement agreeing that they've been heard and that this resolved the complaint, we still find value in the conversation that these mediators allow the participants to have in those mediations. And so regardless of how they walk out of the room, hopefully that conversation transforms, as we mentioned earlier, their perspectives of each other and or their perspectives of themselves and their contributions to that incident. So Cammie, do you have any other questions that come through?
I do. How do you enforce discipline for police officers who don't show up or who show up and don't participate? And when a complaint comes in and a police officer participates, does that prevent any other discipline being issued internally to that officer?
So I'll answer that one since it's procedural. It's in our statute that all parties, community members and police officers, have to participate in good faith. As Catherine mentioned, there is no definition of good faith. We interpret that to mean that you're willing and able to, willing to participate and make yourself available to participate in mediation, to have that conversation that both of these mediators have talked about. We have seen, as Catherine mentioned, some communities show up and it's like, I'll go through it, but I'm not going to agree to any resolution. To us, that's not good faith, because the whole goal of mediation isn't actually a disposition for us. We are supposed to be able to close cases out with mediation, resolved mediation. And so if we can't effectuate that disposition and the participants are not allowing us to effectuate that disposition, not by a disagreement, but by intention, then we don't go through with that disposition. We will not allow the mediation to go forward. So that was kind of what Catherine was indicating. So the statute also says if an officer fails to appear or does not, because of the good faith, they have to show up, and it says if they fail to appear, we are required to send a memo over to the chief of police, who then can offer discipline for the failure to appear. The statute, so if the mediation does not resolve and it goes back to investigation and misconduct is found in the investigation, and it goes through the process of a report of investigation back to the Metropolitan Police Department. If we find misconduct through our adjudication process, the chief of police per statute has to discipline. We don't get a say in discipline, we don't recommend discipline, but by allegations of found misconduct requires in the statute the chief of police to discipline. So going through a mediation does not mitigate any further discipline that's found if it's unresolved and goes back to the investigation. I also want to point out, I get asked this a lot, we do not, mediation, we will refer a case to mediation regardless of misconduct if we think there's a valid misunderstanding or a valid conversation that can be had in mediation. And so we will send those forward as well.
Thank you.
Time for
I think we have time
Cammie,
for one more.
Okay.
What advice as mediators would you give other oversight agencies developing mediation programs? And I would add to that, maybe not just developing, but also maybe working to revamp existing programs.
Do we have time for both of them to answer that briefly, Cammie?
Sure.
Catherine, do you want to go first?
Well, you go first, because yeah.
Waleed, your turn.
It's to put a process that actually can weed out and figure out which bucket does the complaint go into, and set up the expectation accordingly. Just like what is happening at the OPC in DC, the office does a good job figuring out where does this complaint is better served. And once it gets to the mediation, it is very well defined that it is basically, although we're not using these words because maybe it's theoretical, it's a communication issue. It's an information gap. It's a data point that needs to be understood by both sides. And just to make it quick, like the feeling part is the most important or central part of this process. And that's what one of the things that I put in my ground rules, that this is a feeling that I would like to hear your feeling as well. And I nod, so that's one of the things that I set up in my ground rules. And that if they hear something that is not their experience or how they experience the event, then that is just a matter of their reality. It's not about the other people, the other person lying. And that speaks to one of those tough ones Catherine was mentioning earlier.
Thank you, Ali. Catherine?
I would just say using independent mediators as you do is, I think, important, because when we walk into the room, we can say, I don't work for the Office of Investigations. I don't work for the DC government. I'm completely independent. And I think that sets a tone of neutrality and credibility for the mediators. It's important.
Cami?
Thank you. We do, unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions, but for those of you out there who have submitted questions, I will forward those on and we'll see if we can get those answered offline for you. But thank you for all of you who submitted questions today. I am so appreciative to the three of you for joining us today to share your expertise and your experiences. I think it's been a very worthwhile and wonderful hour for us and our attendees. I also want to thank all of those of you who registered and signed up today to attend. It is good to have all of you, particularly when we aren't all together, even in our own communities right now. So thank you all for joining. I just want to remind you that this webinar will be recorded, or it has been recorded, but will be posted within the next 30 days on our website. So if you'd like to go back and review some of the information, it will be available. And then also we do have some upcoming webinars and also some information about our annual conference that will be coming out shortly. So please look out for that information as well. Thank you again to our speakers and to our registrants, and we look forward to having you all at our next training event. Thank you.
Thanks.